All right. Wow, what terrible visual here. Got bad lighting, I guess. I don't know how to change that. Let's see, what can we do to change that? I'm not sure. Oh. Okay. Well, we'll just deal with the lighting. All right. Okay. So let's get going on our lecture. We're talking about development, sustainable development, human rights, self-determination, development from within, right? Development from the outside and what all that meant, okay? So today I want to talk about the case of Awas Tingni. We've been referring to it all semester, right? We have a reading on the case, a piece that I did in 2014 from a book that was called Occupy the Earth, Movements in International Environmental Movements, okay? So that's what our reading is from, and detailing the case. But I wanted to go through all the methods, how we did it, and maybe it can make a little bit more sense to you as we talk about the details, okay? Can somebody close the door for me? Would you mind? Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, so our case is in a place called Awas Tingni. This is one of 9 Mayagna territories. The Mayagna are about 40,000, if you remember, okay? So we have a population of about 40,000. When we first started working with them in the early 1990s, we thought that maybe there were only 2,000, right? We had a historian by the name of Edward Consemius in the early 1800s. He stated that their population was around maybe 8,000, and that likely if they'd still be 2,000 by today. So people just kind of started to forget about their population numbers and didn't check in with them because they were so far away from the main urban areas. A lot of the indigenous territories of the Mayagna don't have roads. Awas Tingni is rare in that it has one road that goes all the way there, but rare that they ever have any transportation that goes that far. Okay, so they gotta hoof it if they want to go take a bus into the main town centers. They gotta hoof it for a good long day. I did this late night one evening when we marched out of our project assessment, right? Okay, so this is an area that's outside of the main part of the Awas Biosphere Reserve. If you remember the Awas Biosphere Reserve, we'll take a look at the maps today, right? It's right on the border of Honduras, right? And we remember that the Awas was pretty much what we would call the forefront or the main front lines of the Sandinista Contra War, right? Sandinista Contra War lasting from about 1979, 1980, all the way through 1990, okay? We only ended that war with what was called an autonomy agreement, okay? Remember, the war started actually in one of the Mayagna indigenous territories, along with other indigenous people that were very upset that the Sandinistas had given away their trees to logging concessions with other countries, right? So that war was started with the CIA supporting that fight against the Sandinistas, right? And you remember that it quite literally broke up the population of the Mayagna into Sandinista and Contra groups fighting against each other. We even talked about the sickness that we call greasy sickness, that it might be something related to PTSD, or it might be something that's increased because of the trauma of 10 years of having to fight each other. Right? Aunties, uncles, cousins, even brothers and sisters. How awful. Yeah? So at the 1990s, this ended because we issued, or they issued, what was called the Autonomy Law. Okay, and it was only through that agreement that the Atlantic coast, the indigenous areas, were going to have their own rule of law, that we would agree to stop fighting, right? Okay, so now you're going to start respecting our interest in our own trees, homelands, and the like, right? So the war stopped, and yet indigenous people were demilitarized. Others that were soldiers that weren't indigenous didn't leave, though. They squatted, A lot of them remain, right? And were not demilitarized. So they still, to this day, have their AK-47s, right? Illegally residing on what is widely recognized as indigenous, now autonomous lands. Not semi-autonomous, fully autonomous lands, right? Okay, so we have a problem with illegal people squatting, now taking trees, now taking gold, right? Cutting vast swaths of the forest to graze their cattle, right? All of a sudden, their families are there, their children are there. Now we have subsequent generations that are developing of colonists and not really sure how to handle this, right? So we have a group of indigenous people that come from their homes up in that northern area down into the Managua town where the Ministry of Natural Resources is, and they say, we need protection of our homelands, right? First thing that the country does is they issue a presidential decree naming the Awas International Biosphere Reserve, right? 7 indigenous territories, I think 4 of them, maybe 5, are Mayagna. Okay, we have also the other group called the Miskitu, which you remember we've talked about in class. Okay, so those groups have been protected both by the naming of a park, which then says we have rules with the park, especially rules that UNESCO enforces, right? Because it's a UNESCO International Biosphere Reserve. Do you remember talking about UN RED? Reduction of environmental devastation and deforestation? That is also another layer on top of the UNESCO park rules, which has been really strict and difficult to deal with. Sometimes saying you can't even harvest your own pigs, right, on your homelands because, well, not typically pigs. We talk about bear, tapir, right? We talk about other animals that the world has deemed endangered or difficult, including trees. So if you're going to build yourself a house, you're going to have to come in after a couple days boat ride and bus ride in and get permission just to cut down one of your trees, which you thought was autonomously yours, right? All right, so we established a park with the idea of protecting the forest because this was happening with squatters, right? What it meant actually was that the indigenous population now are more regulated than ever before, right? Can't do what they want, can't do what they were doing before, now are going to get sanctioned both internationally and nationally. And we have this extra call that says, hey, you know, you said sovereignty, you said autonomy, right? What about our rights to land? You can't just give us autonomy and then not give us our rights to land, right? Okay, so the next push was for rights to land. Started with, well, a number of things, but for 35 years, the Mayagna were at it in terms of fighting and defending themselves. In 2001, right, they had reached their limits within the country of fighting, right, within the country courts to protect the lands of Awas Tingni, okay? Now, Awas Tingni lives along the buffer zone of the Awas, so it's not directly inside. Their lands are both pine forest and also broadleaf rainforest. So it's a really interesting collection of both species and also forest types, right? 2001, they won the right to be able to be heard in the Inter-American Human Rights Court. Now, this is under the UN, under the OAS, for our regional jurisdiction for arguing cases, okay? And we won, right? We won, which meant that we won the fact that Nicaragua was not defending the rights indigenous people had in their country that they guaranteed by their laws to land, to survival, really, because they weren't even able to survive outside of their land as a people, right? So they won the right to a couple things. One was to get their land. Of course, then we had no idea how to do that process. So we had to figure out how to do that process, right? And one of the first things we said was, gosh, you know, we're going to have to come up with how Nicaragua is going to recognize people as ethnic groups or indigenous. So we had to define them in law. Most countries around the world take a time to do this. You know how we define it. How do we define it? Do you remember? How do we define indigeneity in this country per law? 25% blood quantum. Okay, right. So Nicaragua, you remember, was different, but we had to establish a law whereby they said, this is what it means to be indigenous, and this is how you're going to get recognized. Okay? So wrote that law. But then we also had to figure out how we were going to defend their right to land, title the land as theirs, protect the land as theirs in perpetuity forever, right? So rather than just come in from the outside, we were talking about this, development from the outside. Rather than do that, we wrote for a grant to the World Bank and we said, how about we do some kind of consultation? We'll go community to community, territory to territory of the whole Atlantic coast, half of the country, right? We'll hire a bunch of other people to do this in a participatory way, and we'll ask people what they think needs to happen with land, right? What they think needs to happen with colonists, and what they think needs to happen in the process of doing this whole thing. And so we came up with recommendations. We came up with a law, ultimately. We passed the law through National Assembly, and then we were able to get started, right? Awas Tingni was one of the first ones that got started, okay? So that's what we'll talk about now, right? So first thing we had to do was come in and meet with everybody, right? We met with Awas Tingni, we met with the UN Special Rapporteur, Dr. James Anaya. You remember who that is, right? So we have the UN DRIP, Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and under the declaration we have a special reporter or rapporteur. So everyone in the world gets to report their indigenous concerns on human rights to that individual, and then they're mandated to come in country and visit and check it out, provided the country allows it, right? So he was there prior to fulfilling this position, and he was their lawyer, right? So we had best lawyer in the world on this, right? We had to identify areas of the land claim, right, that they'd had over time. We had to identify what areas were crossing claims with other groups. We had to identify areas where there were colonists. Prior to our work, right, we started our field work in 2003. Do you think that's a long time from 2001 to get this sentence, right, in the Inter-American Human Rights Court to getting into the field by 2003? That's 2 years, right? Took that to do the consultation on the law and then register the law and then register for funding, get the funding, and get started. Actually pretty fast, if you ask me. I mean, it was a lot of work to do, okay? Had to develop the methods, what sheets we were going to use in door-to-door surveys, right? All of the things we had to develop, okay? So we're wanting to identify previous claims, current claims, crossing claims. We want to talk about how the people live, right? How dependent are they on the forest? I can tell you about 30 or 74% dependent on the rainforest. How did we figure that? We'll talk about that. But being able to say that means that, hey, you take away their lands and you're taking away their survival. You annihilate an indigenous people in the world and you're talking about genocide and something that we can take you to court in the Inter-American Human Rights Court, obviously, but in the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, right? Highly punishable. All we need is for one of the politicians from Nicaragua to go traveling. We can arrest them, throw them in jail, and take on with this case in the international level, right? This is how things happen under the ICC and those kinds of courts, okay? So we also knew that in order to do this process, we couldn't just come in from the outside and decide how it was done and do it ourselves. I didn't know Awas Tingni. I didn't know any of the folklore of the land. I don't know the language perfectly well. Not only that, might be that they have a specific dialect, right? There was a group called Matumbak, and they have a special dialect called Bawika. No other indigenous territory of the Mayagna speak it. And of that, maybe 10 elders are speaking it. So difficult to have those language issues as well in this process, right? So we had to first present the methods and a proposal to the state government and ministries. We're kind of in the middle of doing that right now with Israel, right? Fascinating time and process right now. Got to talk about the environment, right? What kinds of laws are respected, land regulation in the country, and how the municipalities are structured under law to be able to know how we're going to have to adjudicate this, stand up for the rights of the indigenous people, and bring it into court if needed, right? If we have conflict with others, right? We also know that, like I said, gotta involve the local population, right? So remember, like last time, we started off meeting with the group saying, hey, anybody here involved in forestry? Anybody here studying forestry? One of the things we found in our study with them was that they had one of the highest levels of numbers of people your age already having graduated from college. Amazing. High, very, very high percentage of people already graduating from college, some already entering into their master's degrees. Absolutely, we had people that knew forestry. We had people that had some experience in GPS, and that we didn't have, we brought from other territories that were working on it as well. So we had indigenous people teaching indigenous, right? It's kind of a 1970s method of development that people developed called campesino or campesinos. Anybody ever heard that? Farmer to farmer? It's a way of working that is based on participatory methods, right? Okay, then we had to develop a database on all of their information, right? We were collecting information by household, so going door to door, asking how many board feet did you collect of each different kind of species? How did we know what species to collect on? We asked them. We said, what are the common things that you collect out of the forest? We start to develop a list. We start to develop categories, medicinal plants, things brought to market, right? Live animals even, okay? Crops, family crops, okay? Then we can start to distinguish by who harvested them, men or women, understand a little bit about the male and female participation in the local economy, the household economic production, and the like, right? So as we're developing this database, we're training people, we're learning, right? And we're developing our instruments for our study. So we're going through a lot of training of them training us, right? And us training them. Remember Paulo Freire and that idea of consciousness raising. We're working together. It's not one banking information in the other. It's a development of knowledge together. All right. We're having a lot of meetings with the territory because we got to make sure every single person there in the territory is completely aware of what we're up to. We have to have 100% participation. If we're going to have a clan group that all have legal rights to their land, we have to have every single name all the way down to the very youngest individual, even if they're only 3 days old. Yeah? You remember one of the problems we ran into was not having birth certificates. So we convinced the state to come out, issue birth certificates. So boom, we have all the legal names and we have all their data, right? Okay. Then we develop that team that goes into the field, okay? Everybody gets their GPS unit. Each one gets one. They get their notebook on where they record their points and what are significant things. And they're dispatched in groups of teams. We had 2 teams that went in Awas Tingni. They went out for about 2-3 weeks, right? They did all of the boundaries, taking points so that every time there was a change in something that wasn't straight, they'd take a point so that we could pretty soon develop what we would call a polygon on a map, right? How many people know GIS? Raise your hands. Oh, yes. Okay, 1. Yay. 2. Yay. All right. Follow up with that. Those that don't know it, do it, right? Please know that Mr. Dangermon, who has his company just right over the hill here, he runs the largest software company for GIS in the whole entire world. We're kind of like a branch of their testing unit, right? And not only that, just a second, not only that, but he just established a platform for kids K through 12 to start learning GIS in kindergarten. So guess what, y'all? You're all behind already. You're going to have to catch up in college. Yes, you're coming.
Well, I know of it.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done it yet myself because I haven't had a chance. But Esri, the building.
Esri, yes.
Yeah, my class went on a trip there.
Great.
And it's amazing. They have like, I think they have tours and stuff. They also
yes.
have, like,
tours, classes.
It's really great.
Very good. We also have a master's in that GIS here. I have a student that's taking that, right? She went, did some work with me over the summer, and now she's getting her master's in GIS. Okay, so we do something with training on GPS. We also go through something that we call cognitive mapping. So yeah, we know the boundaries. We can figure out the boundaries because people have an idea as to where they are. Oh, you remember that big tree that looks like, or the beginning of the river over here, or some kind of significant site, right? But on the inside of the territory is a whole nother level. Sacred sites, traditional hunting trails, right? Places where people are harvesting gold. What do you think? Should we put that on a map? Should we put on a map where we're harvesting gold in our traditional communities? No, we say no, right? There was one group that did a big mapping project of sacred plants in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, and they refused to put any specific location on their plants. It was mapping, but they wanted to keep the mapping information only for their culture, right? Obviously, there's a threat. This group decided completely to the opposite. Go figure, it's gold, right? You'd think it'd be like one of the most precious and things to be protected. No, they want it marked on a map because we want to know that if you're going to come and try and take it, it's ours. And we know it's there. So don't even think, right? So that's another kind of approach that they took toward it. Right, so we had to go through an exercise where we're literally drawing a map on paper, right? And having people kind of draw in pen and sometimes in crayon and pencil and whatnot to develop their map that's in their head. Remember we talked about cognitive mapping, I think it was week 3, right? And methods. Okay, this is what we're doing. Then, I think I remember mentioning in the past, a lot of our meetings that we would have men and women invited. The men would sit on the inside in the school area where we were all meeting, and the women would be on the outside looking in through the windows, right? They weren't there. We had invited them. We wanted them to come inside. We even asked them to come inside. No, we'd prefer to stay out here, right? It was their level of traditional respect that they wanted to have. So due to that, we had to account for that and have special meetings just with women, right? So we had focus groups where women were talking with women, moderating the discussion in a language that was Mayagna, right? Remember, not all of them were speaking Spanish. In an environment that was safe, right? For them to be able to be involved in that way, per their culture, per their interests, okay? At the end of everything, we finalize our plan with the population. How do we do this? We're all in a massive process of writing up the report, drawing up the map, right? Some in this process learn to do the GIS on the CAD program on computers, right? We had elders involved, checking the maps, checking the names, checking the stories that we had obtained. We went and got all the stories related to the land. Also, that's part of the evidence, right? Okay. Had to go through judicial analysis of all of their titles, right? There was a process that the whole entire country went through what we call agrarian reform. Remember the period of Somoza with the dictatorship, claiming virtually all of the country as his personal property. When he was overthrown, then we had this issue with land. So the whole country went through a process of, well, let's take all those lands that are in just the hands of a few and redistribute it. So they went through agrarian reform. So we had to go all the way back to the beginning and then go back through agrarian reform to check on all of the titles, quiet those titles to some regard, yeah, if we had any, and then start to present a bid for what we called a clear title, so full rights and ownership. One of the things that was interesting in the consultation for the law, the indigenous people said, we want the land in perpetuity, inalienable. That means we can't alienate it, chunk it off, and sell it. We want it forever. Nobody can ever sell it, ever. Okay? So under the law, that was how the indigenous land title was written. So when they receive title to the land, it says in perpetuity, never to be sold. Anybody tries to sell it, we just take them to court, get it reversed, and we're back to the beginning again, right? And it happens a lot, okay? You can imagine people get in situations, remember the finance for the average household with Awas Tingni, we found out it was about $800 a year, right? Think about how much you're going to buy, what you're going to buy off of $800 a year. It's going to have to incorporate everything in the household: kids, parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles, food, medicine, education, everything, right? So important that we preserve these lands for people that are so critical to their existence, right? All right, so amassing up this study, we came to the territory itself, had another meeting, said, look, here's all our data, here's all our maps, right? This is how we did it. This is what you said. The last piece of the whole entire survey, I think I mentioned, we tacked on a couple of questions about what are issues that are important to you. And they said, we've got a road, but we can't use anything to get there on it. We don't have a car, we don't have bus, we don't have, so they wanted to try and figure out transportation, right? That was, well, actually number 2. Number 1 was land rights, right? Land title, okay? I think after that, it was either education or health, or the other switched, right? So, in terms of the mapping, we wanted to discover the traditional areas of use because we might have things like cemeteries there of our ancestors, right? Remember, we're semi-nomadic, meaning we travel during the seasons when we're planting crops, and then about every 25 years we were moving, right? So that means every 25 years we had been moving across the territory, which means we've got a lot of cemeteries, right? And maybe other kinds of sites that we should be weary of or leery of, right? So, taking a look at traditional and actual uses, shared uses, and conflicts, we have to find out where the conflicts are. One anthropologist went before us, worked with Awas Tingni, found out about a community that was illegal, right? Squatters. Said, you know, don't even want to map it. They're illegal, right? Good argument, I guess, right? They're illegal. They shouldn't be on the map, not going to put them on the map. So he decided not going to do that. Issued the map, community went to court, presented the map in court. The other community that wasn't on the map said, what? Right? Judge said, do it over. That's why we had to do it over, right? So had to present the conflict so that the judge or the court system can look and make some kind of a decision about it. Otherwise, we've gone through the process and it's almost like we've had a misjudgment, right? Or mistrial, as it were, right? So in our mapping process, we're identifying boundary markers, and then we're actually establishing those landmarks, right? We call them mojones or boundary markers. Had to build those boundary markers so that others, once we do get the right to land, will be able to respect it, right? Training even some to go around the perimeter and monitor the boundaries to make sure people aren't coming in, right? Illegally. Another thing that we had to be concerned about was, how are we going to deal with these crossing claims? Are we going to allow some colonists to stay? They wanted that in the law. When we consulted the whole entire Atlantic coast, they said, we want to be able to, territory by territory, decide who stays, because we've got some people that are really nice and they've been here for a while, right? End of the war, 1990. Think about where we are today. Long time, right? People have been living there and having kids there, going to school there, albeit illegally. Some of them are okay, right? So we had some that decided, we want these people to say, we want these people to go, because these guys have been doing nothing but cutting down the trees, right? They're going, or they've been violent, right? So we had to go through that process as well to identify not only the overlapping claims, but who they wanted out, right? Okay. All right. So talked about past mapping efforts. Our mapping efforts and our study was done 2003, 2004. If you remember, we had to go back in 2004. Do you remember that story? We want to keep everything confidential, right? So all of our survey papers had actual names on it, because we had to write down all the names of people so that it could go on the title, right? I was instructed, okay, remove the names, right? Said we entered all the data in our database. All the Indigenous people did. We even got pictures of them doing it. So we got all the evidence and everything. We got all the data. So what do we do now? Take the original data, burn it, right? Burn the data sheets. We're done with it. We don't want any kind of notes of names or anything that exists there at all. So we burned it. And guess what? Government wanted the originals. So we had to go back and do the whole thing again. But it allowed us, instead of only having 6 months of data for harvest data, right? Temporal data, longitudinal data, remember? Data collected over time. We had 6 months of data, then we came back and did the next 6 months of data. So we had a whole entire annual round of their behavior economically, culturally, and the like. And that was amazing, right? One of the most complete studies that we had, okay? All right, so let's take a look at some of these maps. First map that we have here is our primary base map. Kind of looks a little busy, doesn't it? Okay, you see all these lines out here on the outside, the red lines, yeah? And they've got little asterisks. That was our first field team that went into the field, and every time they made a turn, right? We like to work on straight lines. Every time they made a turn, then we'd have a waypoint that was taken, right? Those of you that know GPS, waypoints are how we take points on a map, right? If you notice and look closely at these maps, we'll have a couple of different house types, right? Let's go look at our legend over here. Do we have it? Oh, they didn't distinguish house types here. Huh. Okay. I think what we're looking at is main residence areas and then temporal residence areas where they're going in to check on their crops. Okay, so that you can see some of their movement in that, right? And then we have some of the mountainous areas, special tree, forested areas. Okay. All right. Next map I want you to look at. Oof, got to blow it up a lot. Sorry about that. Oh, why can't we do that? Let's see here. Don't know why it's opening that way. Let's see. Let me just kind of maximize this window. Oh, I can move it. No, I can't. Okay. Well, maybe you can see basically and generally with this map that this is what we're talking about as the Mesoamerican biological corridor. Do you remember talking about that? No? Do you remember looking at Google Earth and following the forest lines all the way from the Amazon through the Central American area, all the way up into the northern Rio Grande? Remember that? Okay, that's what we call the Mesoamerican biological corridor, okay? This whole area right through here, here's the Awas, going all the way up into the Petén, Oaxaca, that whole forested area of Mexico, right? What I'm trying to show you with this map is that that area of the Awas, you see how dark it is, crisscrossed, not just because it's a park, but also because it's densely forested. That's a critical point, ecological population area in the continuance of the forest and the ability of the forest to migrate, even trees migrate, yes, and species, other species as well. Okay, so if we're going to preserve this forest, including any changes that might happen in the future with climate, we have to preserve this method of movement. Okay, and this is a key biological corridor, right? Let's see how I can get out of this now. There we go. Minimize. Okay, so then we've got our map of Nicaragua, right? Do you see the buffer zone on the map of the Awas? You see where the Awas is, right? Everybody can identify that now. Up north on the top, it's got like this kind of light green. There's a big dark green spot in the middle. That's the Sazlaya National Park. Okay, that's a lot more greener than everywhere else, but that's what that is, right? So that one right here. You see the area around here, that's considered the buffer zone. Remember we spoke about projects that weren't quite very good, and we had one that the EU was sponsoring where they were trying to develop cattle ranching in this area, which pretty much denuded the whole entire buffer zone, eliminated it, right? Okay. We have edge effect with everything from wind to fire to other kinds of issues that just topple the edges of forest, which means that just little by little it encroaches that buffer, okay? Right, so we also had to go through a process of learning topo maps because we were asking them to develop topography maps, right? It wasn't just a map of their area, a map of the crossing claims, a map of the forest and things that were important. It was something that was going to be showing elevation as well. So we had to go through a big process whereby we were learning how to read maps. Here's your cognitive mapping picture where we're drawing the outside lines of the territory, noting that it goes along one of the main rivers, the Wawa River. Here's something really neat. Anybody remember the story about the Waula? Do you remember the story about the Waula? The anaconda, the mythical anaconda that the Mayagna believed in, right? Has feathers and the like, called the Waula, okay? Look at. Remember we talked about how they identified the core area that people just didn't go anymore, and they called it the Waula zone, yeah? Kind of amazing for us anthropologists. We think, well, obviously nobody would want to go in there. How creative that they called it such. But look, no, here's an actual place where they had sightings of Waula. If you look around 1890, they even have the dating of one of their towns that they were living in and have since vacated, right? So this is a pretty fascinating map. Note it's also in crayon. Do we really need tons of technology for defending land rights? No, we just need to get started, right? Crayons, or take a look at this map. This map is from paper bark that's been pounded. They use that for artisanry. This would be called a non-timber forest product, right? If they were doing like an artisanry piece on it, which they do. But for their purposes, they used it to make a map. It's really old. This is an old map, maybe 100 years or something. The ink that is used on it comes from plants. They knew maps were critical, and they were making their own maps long time back. This is a lot of really interesting evidence talking about how long they've been around and how long they've been at trying to protect their lands. Pretty amazing, huh? Okay, let's look at another one of the Awas Tingni maps. Tercero, so we call them third third population group. So not your indigenous group specifically, not the residents, but the crossing claims of colonists. So we had, if you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, we had some logging concessions, right? And then we had some other areas that were identified even by some squatters that were Miskitu, right? Not from their indigenous group, but they had been armed from the war and they just stayed. Oh no, now we have intertribal conflict, right? Great. Remember, when we have conflicting claims, then we also have to go and negotiate them, okay? Let's see. Next one. Here are some of the crossing claims from the communities around the edges of them. Oh crap, do you see what I see? How much percentage is actually there for the people? You see this area over here to the left? That's the only area that's not being claimed. See that? Oh no, right? It's not looking so good here, okay? This is the concession map for logging. Oh no, place all of these on top of each other and there's just a small little area that's being left for Awas Tingni, right? We don't protect it, we let the colonists just ravage the forest and that's all that's left for them. And guess what? Their main towns are over here on the eastern part of their territory. So we're surrounding their community with denuded landscape instead, right? Pretty bad news for them, okay? All right, so remember one of the things that we talked about in terms of indigenous land rights was this unfortunate case where, yeah, they can get rights to land, but now under the way we've been doing it in this way, they have to prove how they're going to use it, okay? So this map shows the Awas Biosphere Reserve. It shows all 7 territories that are a part of it. It shows all of their maps together, right? So it's demonstrating where all of their land use areas are. The green area, I'll remind you, was the Waula zone, right? And then they have areas of infrequent hunting, areas of frequent hunting, pasture areas, mining, protection of streams, and the like, okay? So yeah, we had to do a land use map. Here's ours for Awas Tingni, right? They were excited to do this land use map actually because they were thinking of it as a way that they were going to be planning all of their territory. It was like this vision in mind that they were getting all of their territory, right? Their total claim was 150,000 hectares, right? And they only got 90,000 hectares and are still struggling with decolonizing the people that have those crossing claims. So they're still dealing with not having a good decolonization process in this whole experience, okay? All right, how many people remember the p-value when you're looking at scientific studies? Do you remember going over that a little bit? Okay, I just threw it up there to remind you that in order for a statistical test to be significant, the p-value has to be less than or equal to 0.05, right? Okay, now that's significant if you're gonna take a look at this article. I just put it up there if you want. You're welcome to take a look at it and I'll tell you a little bit about it. This is a study that we did. This is the main anthropologist that I worked with on all this work in Nicaragua. His name is Dr. Anthony Stocks, now retired from Idaho State. And he's done a full assessment using satellite imagery. So remember our maps? We went steps further with our maps and we obtained the images of satellite images from dates every 10 years. So we wanted to do this because we saw more colonist communities cropping up, right? And then we saw the change of the forest happening. And we said, I wonder if there's any way to see who's doing more of it, right? And lo and behold, we did that. And we were able to layer the colonist communities and the indigenous communities on top of the maps and find out exactly what was going on, all the way down to the minute details of numbers of hectares that were being removed, percentage of forest cover that was being destroyed. Okay? Why don't you take a look at some of our numbers here, right? Well, let's go down to the specifics right here. Overall disturbance is what I'm looking at, okay? We found in 9, 10-year period increments, right? One of the maps we did, we've done about 4 sets of these since then, and the data seems to be increasing in both directions, okay? So it's very consistent with this, okay? We had a 9-year period where disturbance of the forest increased 9.1%, and then even higher in the next increment to 14.4%. So we know our forest is being cut more, okay? It's worse, okay? Then we found that there were differences per area, okay? And we found that there was, let's see, I think it was a 16 to 17% cutting rate that lined up with all the colonist communities. So all the colonists in the territory were cutting the rainforest at about 16 to 17% every year. That's a lot, okay? And then we found out the indigenous areas, this is not just Awas Tingni, this is the whole entire Awas area, right? The indigenous areas were cutting at a negative 1%. What does that mean? That's weird. Kind of head scratcher, right? How can they cut at a negative percent? Come on. How did they do that? They're planting. Yeah, they're cutting and they're taking out, but they're planting, if not maybe even more, right? So they're busy reforesting, taking out, but reforesting makes sense, right? This is their sole property. They're 74, 75% dependent on it. They're gonna do that, right? And then we have the illegals who are kind of running out of time and being on the property, and they're cutting 16 to 17% of the forest. Kind of a no-brainer, right? If we're going to protect the forest, this is a no-brainer, right? That's why it was so easy to take this case to court, okay? We had a couple of other things that we found that were surprising.